The night my home went up in flames. The air stank of smoke and arrogance. I stood barefoot on the driveway, my robe soaked from the garden hose I had grabbed in a desperate, useless attempt to stop the blaze. And there she was, Karen. She didn't even flinch at the fire devouring the house I had built with my own hands. Instead, she stood on the curb, her bloated figure outlined by the inferno, lips curled into a satisfied smile. In her hand was a red gas can, still dripping, still reeking. She had demanded I repaint the house in HOA-approved colors. I had refused. Now she had delivered her verdict in fire. Neighbors gathered, some weeping, others whispering, but no one dared confront her. She turned to them and shouted over the roar of the flames. "This is what happens when you defy community rules." He thought he was above the HOA. But no one is above me. My fists clenched so hard my nails dug into my palms. Every fiber of me wanted to lunge at her, to silence her gloating. But I stood frozen, staring at the destruction of decades of memories. Photographs, books, heirlooms, all eaten by the blaze because of her twisted hunger for control. The fire trucks arrived minutes later, but it was already too late. By dawn, my home was a blackened skeleton, smoke still curling into the pale sky. Karen strutted up the street as if she had won a war, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Such a shame," she said loudly enough for others to hear. If only he had followed the rules, this wouldn't have happened. But what Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I was not just any homeowner. I was Judge Thomas Gray, veteran of the county bench, and the very man who would soon preside over her case. At first, I played it calm. The sheriff's deputies who responded that night noted the gas can in her hand, the lighter in her pocket, the neighbors who had seen her shouting threats days earlier. She was arrested at dawn, her shrill protests echoing down the street. "I am the HOA president. I have immunity. This is a community matter, not a crime." But the deputies weren't impressed. They cuffed her and shoved her into the cruiser while cameras from news crews recorded every second. When the district attorney's office learned I was the victim, they hesitated, worried about conflict of interest. I recused myself from the initial hearings, watching as another judge approved her charges: arson, destruction of property, reckless endangerment. But fate has a way of circling back. Karen's defense filed motion after motion, demanding dismissal, insisting the fire was an accident or a misunderstanding. Each was denied. And when her trial finally arrived, the docket came before me. As chief judge of the circuit, I could not recuse again. The irony was staggering. Karen would stand trial before the very man whose house she had burned. The day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Neighbors filled the gallery, some trembling, others eager to see justice. Karen shuffled in wearing a blazer too tight across her chest, her hair lacquered in defiance. She scanned the room, her eyes widening when they met mine. For the first time, her arrogance faltered. She whispered to her lawyer, gesturing frantically, but there was no escape. Court was in session. The prosecution laid out their case with ruthless clarity. Photos of the charred remains of my home. Testimony from neighbors who had seen her carry the gas can. A forensic report confirming accelerants had been poured at multiple entry points. And then came the twist: a teenager named Alex, who had been biking past that night, stepped forward. He admitted he had filmed part of the scene on his phone. The courtroom went silent as the screen lit up with shaky footage. Karen's voice rang clear, shrieking, "This is what happens when you break the rules." Her face glowed with firelight, her hand clutching the canister. The evidence was irrefutable. Karen exploded, leaping from her seat, jabbing her finger at the screen. That video is fake. Doctored. He's lying. She screamed. The bailiff restrained her, the jury recoiling at her ferocity. I sat steady, my gavel in hand, my voice calm but cold as steel. The evidence stands. The jury will disregard her outburst. She slumped back into her seat. But the damage was done. Her lawyer tried to spin it as stress, as a lapse in judgment, even daring to argue that the HOA bylaws gave her authority to enforce compliance. That was the final straw. I leaned forward, my voice cutting through the courtroom. No bylaw, no rule, no imagined authority gives you the right to burn a man's home. The law is not your toy, and tonight it will remind you of that. The gallery erupted in murmurs. The truth finally spoken in the very room she thought she could manipulate. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their faces were grave but certain. Guilty on all counts, the foreman declared. Karen's face contorted, her body shaking as she shrieked. You can't do this to me. I am the HOA. I am the law here. But her words dissolved into sobs as deputies took her arms, pulling her to her feet. And then came the moment I had waited for. Sentencing. I looked down at the woman who had stolen so much yet stood before me powerless. My voice did not tremble. You burned my house, endangered lives, and terrorized a community under the delusion that you were above the law. You are not above it. You are beneath it now. I sentence you to 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 10. My gavel came down with a crack like thunder, and with it, Karen's empire ended. The courtroom had already erupted in murmurs when my gavel fell for the last time that day. But I will never forget the look on Karen's face as deputies pulled her toward the holding cell. Gone was the bloated pride, the smug certainty, the swagger of a self-crowned queen. In its place was raw panic, a hollow shell of the arrogance that had fueled her crimes. Her voice cracked as she shrieked over the din. This isn't fair. You can't judge me. I am the president of the HOA. I am the community. But the sound of her voice was drowned by the rustle of neighbors applauding, tears glistening on faces that had lived under her iron grip for far too long. In the days that followed, the fallout was unlike anything I had seen in all my years on the bench. News channels replayed the video of her standing before the flames, shouting about rules as my house burned. Commentators condemned her cruelty. Legal experts marveled at her audacity, and social media turned her name into a cautionary tale. Hashtags spread like fire. HOA justice. Karen burnout. Law not HOA. For once, people across the nation were talking not about bylaws or fines, but about the danger of unchecked power when given to the wrong hands. The neighborhood itself was a different place. Without Karen's constant notes, threats, and unannounced inspections, the air felt lighter. Neighbors who had avoided each other out of fear now gathered freely. Porches that once had to conform to her narrow tastes bloomed with flowers of every color. Families hosted barbecues without worrying about unauthorized gatherings. And children who had been scolded by Karen for playing too loudly laughed and played on the sidewalks without fear. Her downfall hadn't just freed me. It had freed everyone. But the twist came in a letter I received weeks later while overseeing another case. It was from Alex, the teenager whose video had sealed Karen's fate. He wrote in careful script, "Judge Gray, I was scared to come forward. Karen always told us she could take away our homes if we disobeyed. But when I showed that video, and you let it play in court, I realized fear doesn't win when truth is louder. Thank you for proving that. I held that letter for a long time, my chest heavy with both pride and sorrow. Pride that his courage had helped deliver justice. Sorrow that it had taken so much pain for the truth to rise. Karen, meanwhile, adjusted poorly to life behind bars. Reports filtered back that she tried to set herself up as a block captain in prison, barking orders at fellow inmates, demanding they follow her rules. But there are no HOA fines in state prison, no bylaws to hide behind, no neighbors to intimidate. The same arrogance that once made her feared now made her a target of mockery. She was just another inmate, stripped of her crown, her words carrying no weight beyond the steel bars that contained her. The symbolic moment of closure for me came when the community gathered to rebuild. Neighbors pooled resources, organized fundraisers, and spent weekends hammering and painting. My house slowly rose again from the ashes, not because of insurance or contractors alone, but because of the hands of people Karen had tried to divide. On the day the roof beams went up, I looked around and saw men and women who had once been silent under her rule now smiling, laughing, lifting together. The flames that were meant to break me had instead forged a stronger bond between us all. When the house was finally finished, we held a gathering in the yard, a true community event, not sanctioned by any board or dictated by any bylaw, but born of gratitude and unity. Mrs. Patel, the retired teacher, raised her glass and said, "To Judge Gray, who stood when we were too scared, and to this neighborhood, which is finally ours again." The cheer that followed shook me to my core, not because it was for me, but because it was proof that Karen's reign was dead and buried. That night, I hammered a wooden sign into the lawn by the rebuilt mailbox. It was simple, carved by Alex and painted by the children of the block. It read, "Justice lives here." Neighbors gathered around it, some snapping photos, others simply nodding in agreement. It wasn't about me alone. It was about the principle that no bully, no matter how loud or arrogant, could stand above the law. The most poignant moment came months later when I presided over an unrelated case. A man stood before me, trembling as he faced charges of harassment against his own neighbors. He tried to justify himself with excuses, tried to claim authority he didn't have. I looked down at him from the bench, the memory of Karen burning my house still fresh. And I said quietly but firmly, "The law does not bend to your pride. It bends only to truth." His shoulders slumped, and I saw in him a shadow of Karen's downfall. Sometimes, when I walk past the oak tree in my yard, I can almost hear the echo of her shrill voice insisting she was the law. But then I hear the laughter of children nearby, the hum of neighbors chatting freely, and I know her echo has no power anymore. The fire she set did not consume me. It consumed her. And so I leave you with this question: when arrogance claims it is above justice, when someone lights flames to enforce their lies, do you let the fire spread in silence, or do you stand firm? Fight back, and remind them that real justice burns brighter than any house fire ever could.